Chapter 31, An Unwelcome Christmas Gift. We spent every Christmas with Granny in Pine Bluff. She was short like me and wore faded dresses that she'd bought way before I was born. Her hair was the color of buttermilk, and that was her drink too, rich and comforting. When we arrived on Christmas Eve, we put up the tree and strung popcorn chains with cranberries on the pine branches. Judy's boyfriend stopped by to help, though she told Mother and Daddy he was her friend, not her boyfriend. I thought Robert Lawrence was as goofy looking as he'd seemed in his picture, but he kept smiling at my sister, and she kept grinning back, so I guess he was okay. Daddy had bought Granny a TV for Christmas. She hadn't had one before. "Don't need one, either. You shouldn't have spent the money," is what she'd said, but after dinner she was the one who said, "Well, as long as that contraption's here, you might as well set it up." So while Mother and Judy and I hung the stockings, David and Daddy unwrapped and positioned the new set. We all sat down with a cup of hot chocolate and a bowl of roasted chestnuts to watch the 10 o'clock news. The weatherman was just starting his report. "Now tonight, we've got something extra special on radar," he said, a twinkle in his eye. "It seems to be a man on a sled being pulled by reindeer." He paused for a moment, examining his screen. "Yes, sir," he said, the weatherman grinning. "I do believe Santa Claus is on his way." Granny laughed so hard I was afraid her false teeth would fall out. After the news, Judy and I went up to her room. There were 2 twin beds and a small desk where Judy did her homework. Even though we were in the same room, I could feel the distance between us. "Which bed should I take?" I asked. "You can have the one by the window," said Judy. I sat down on the worn quilt. There was a large chestnut tree just outside the window. "Did Granny get the chestnuts from the tree?" I asked. Judy didn't respond. When I turned to look at her, I realized she was already asleep. I could never sleep on Christmas Eve, so I sat up and gazed at the moon and stars through the branches. Even though I knew I was too old, I kept hoping to see Santa. I didn't feel tired at all, but I guess at some point I must have put my head on the pillow, because a moment later Judy was shaking me awake. "Merry Christmas, Marley." I smiled back. "Merry Christmas, Judy." I put on my robe and followed her downstairs. Daddy stood at the bottom, leaning against the railing and sipping a cup of coffee. "There you girls are." He winked at me and said, "I think Santa might have left you something." There were oranges and walnuts in my stockings. Judy and I each got new socks and a new sweater. Cashmere, mine was pink and hers was green. And I got a copy of the new Buddy Holly album. That'll be the day. I was just going to ask to use Granny's record player when Daddy cleared his throat and said, "I believe there's one more present no one has opened yet." I glanced around the room. I didn't see any open boxes. "Where?" "You have to find it," said Daddy. "Who's it for?" asked Judy. "All of you," said Daddy. Judy and David started searching, then looking in corners and boxes and under scraps of paper. I sat still for a moment and watched Daddy. He kept glancing at the tree. I went over and looked between the glass balls and the popcorn chains for an ornament we hadn't hung there the day before. It only took me a minute to find it. A small wooden airplane, hand-carved, with a note taped to the tail. "Marley's found it!" exclaimed Daddy. Everyone crowded around me. "What does it say?" asked David. I unfolded the note and cleared my throat. "This entitles the Nesbit family to one airplane ride from Pine Bluff to Little Rock." "An airplane ride?" Mother asked. "Oh, Daddy!" Judy exclaimed, racing over to give him a big hug. "How exciting!" "Wow," said David. "An airplane ride?" I repeated Mother's words. Daddy picked up the small wooden plane and made it soar through the air like a little boy playing with a toy. "Flight is one of the modern miracles. Why, I tell you, there's nothing like soaring high over the trees like a bird." Flying meant we'd be high in the air looking down, kind of like standing on top of the high dive. And that was not an experience I wanted to have again. "An airplane ride is expensive," said Mother. "We usually buy the children's savings bonds." "Thought we needed something a little more exciting this year," said Daddy. "Are you going to come with us?" Judy asked Daddy. Nah, I've already been up in the airplane twice. Besides, somebody's got to drive back the car back to Little Rock. How about Granny? Asked David. You want to come along? Granny shook her head. I remember the first time I rode in an automobile. Seemed unnatural then to move across the ground so quickly. But flying? No, thank you. I'm not a bird, and I'm keeping my 2 feet firmly on the ground. Then she smiled sheepishly. Besides, I want to stay home and watch my new TV. Everyone laughed then. Everyone except me. I was longing for a savings bond. Chapter 32. The Airplane Ride. While we were at Granny's, Judy talked about Robert Lawrence so much, David threatened to start charging her a nickel every time she said his name. To be fair, she also asked about my math lessons with Mr. Harding and painted my nails and listened to the Buddy Holly album with me until we both knew all the words by heart. But there was still a distance between us, silences in our conversations where there used to be none. No matter what I did, I couldn't find the right moment to tell her about Liz. All too soon, it was December 31st, and we were driving to the airport. My stomach was one big knot. I knew I was going to hate flying. I didn't like new things. I didn't like heights. Planes were new, and they were high in the air. Plus, they sometimes crashed. All those things were bad. I wished I could stay with Granny watching the nice safe TV, but Daddy was so excited and had spent so much money on the tickets, I couldn't disappoint him. Besides, Liz would kill me if I had a chance to go up in an airplane and didn't take it. At least I had the feather she'd given me in my pocket. A black feather had helped Dumbo fly. Maybe it could help me too. The Pine Bluff Airport was a new building of cement block. There was a small waiting area with seats and tables and 2 big doors with numbers over them. A man with a cart was selling Cokes and candy bars. We had about an hour before our flight, so Daddy went over to him and came back carrying a bag of treats. I opened a payday and the smell of peanuts and caramel, which I usually loved, made me feel sick. Great. The first time in my life I ever got a candy bar all to myself, and I couldn't even take a bite. The others chatted and ate, and the minutes crept by, both too long and a way too short. Daddy drained the last of his Coke and glanced at his watch. Only 10 more minutes. I'm going to check you all in at the gate. Mother and Judy got up to look at the plane out the window, but David stayed at the table with me. You gonna eat that? He said, pointing at my candy bar. I shook my head. He picked it up and took a bite. What's going on with you, Judy? What's going on with you and Judy? David asked, his mouth full of peanuts. I don't know what you're talking about, I said. Come on, Marley. Usually you and Judy are all up in your room, girl, talking so fast I can't understand half of what you say. I hadn't realized anyone had noticed. You're acting funny now, too, he said. No, I'm not. You scared about the plane ride? People aren't supposed to fly. Granny said so. Granny also said TV was a silly invention, back before she got one of her own. I made a face. Besides, said David, I thought you wanted to build rockets. Build them, not fly in them. David laughed, and I stuck my tongue out at him. He made me feel a little better. I didn't think Daddy would purposely try to kill us all, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a very bad idea. Daddy came back then, bouncing in his shoes. It's time. They're going to start boarding. We threw our trash away, and I made sure the black feather was safely in my pocket. Daddy rounded up Mother and Judy and made us all stand in line before one of the doors. He handed each of us a small piece of paper which read Trans-Texas Airways, Pine Bluff, Arkansas, to Little Rock, Arkansas. Then Daddy went down the line and kissed us all, like we were going on a long trip, like we were going off to war, like he was never going to see us again. Have fun, he called as he waved and walked off. A woman with a cute short haircut and a navy blue suit took our tickets and ushered us out the door. We stood on the runway until another woman in a matching suit led us across the cement to the plane. There was a set of metal stairs going up to the plane. I can't do it, I mumbled, standing in front of the stairs. They looked just like the high dive. The engines were warming up, and it was so loud no one could hear me. I'm not going, I yelled. Mother was ahead of me. What? She called, turning back briefly. But she wasn't really listening. I automatically followed her. I willed myself to stop, and after a moment, I did, right on the second step. David leaned over and shouted into my ear, Keep moving, sis. I shook my head, and he pushed me from behind. I would have fallen, but my stupid feet caught me, and I started going up the stairs. The wind picked up and blew my hair in my face. I felt dizzy. My hands were hot, and my feet were cold, and everyone sounded funny, like people talking underwater at the pool. It was like when I did the class presentation. I'd been sure I was going to faint then, too, but I hadn't. I'd actually done a pretty good job. I stuck my hand in my pocket and touched the tip of the feather. Before I knew it, I was ducking inside the plane. It was just a metal tube, with 2 seats on either side of the narrow aisle. Mother sat with David, and Judy and I sat next to each other. The stewardess showed us how to buckle our seatbelts. When I looked out the window, I could see a man directing the plane onto the runway. The plane began to move, and I closed my eyes. I squeezed them tight until I saw silver stars on the inside of my lids. I wasn't going to open them again until this was all over and we were safely on the ground. Or until we were dead, smashed all over the concrete. I thought the second possibility was much more likely. But then the plane gave a funny lurch like nothing I had ever felt before, and without thinking, I opened my eyes and glanced out the window. We were only a few feet off the ground, but as the plane got higher, quickly rocking back and forth as it climbed. It was a gentle motion, not scary like being in a cradle for grown-ups. We flew over the airport parking lot, and I caught a glimpse of Daddy standing by the car, waving like a madman. A moment later, he was gone. The trees were smaller now, and the roads looked like strips of paper. We were sailing over an old quarry, and a river, and lots of forest. I turned to Judy. Isn't this amazing? Judy was staring directly ahead, her face pale, her lips green. Are you okay? I asked. Don't talk to me, Judy said. I glanced over at David and Mother. Mother had one hand on her forehead and was leaning against the seat in front of her. David tried to smile. You all right? I asked. Just a little sick, said David. I felt great. We were flying over a highway now, racing the cars that looked like toys on the road below. Everything went white, and it took me a moment to realize we had flown into a cloud. The cloud looked so solid I'd have sworn I could have jumped on it like a feather bed, and yet the plane cut through it as easily as a hot knife in butter. After a moment, I could see the green ground below again, playing peekaboo with me through the holes in the clouds. The woman in the navy uniform came by. Would you like anything to drink? Judy shook her head. She turned to me. Coke or coffee? Coke, please, I said firmly, just like a grown-up. Then I realized I had spoken to a stranger, and I hadn't even counted prime numbers first. The stewardess handed me a small glass bottle, exactly like the one I had been unable to drink at the airport a few minutes before. I was suddenly starving and wished I had saved my candy bar instead of offering it to my brother. As if she had read my mind, she handed me a package of peanuts. First time in a plane, she asked. I nodded. For all of us. The words were bubbling out now, fizzing like a shook-up soda. It was a Christmas gift from my daddy. The stewardess smiled at me. How nice of him. I glanced over at Judy. She still had her eyes closed. Don't worry about your sister, said the stewardess. Some people get motion sickness. I'll get you a bag in case she needs to be ill. I nodded again. How about you, sweetie? Are you feeling okay? Great, I said, popping a handful of peanuts in my mouth. An iron stomach, she laughed. Maybe someday you'll grow up to be a stewardess like me. Then she turned away to take care of Mother and David. A stewardess like her, in a fancy blue uniform and flying in a plane like this every day, it sounded like a dream. I stared out the window and watched the clouds and the crops planted in neat square rows. And I tried to remember every detail so I could tell Liz all about it. Too soon, the stewardess came back, making sure we had our seatbelts fastened because it was time to land. My eyes grew dry as I stared out the window, refusing to blink. refusing to miss a single second of watching the trees and roads and cars and houses slowly grow larger and larger. There was a bump when we landed, and I heard Mother cry out, but truthfully, it wasn't any worse than going over a pothole in the car. On the ground, I could feel how fast we were going. The brakes screeched, and we slowly came to a stop. "Thank God," said Judy. She had the bag the stewardess had given her clutched in one hand. "Amen," said Mother. I thanked God that neither one of them had actually thrown up. We got out of our seats and followed the rest of the people to the front of the plane. The door to the cockpit was open, and there were 2 men in uniform inside, with hundreds of buttons and wires behind them. They stood greeting each of the passengers as they exited. "Hello there," the older man said to me. "Did you enjoy the flight?" I grinned, too overwhelmed to say anything. "You don't even need to ask, Bill," said the younger man. "Look at the way her eyes are shining." As soon as we got home, I called Liz. I told her all about the plane ride. Must have talked for 10 minutes straight. "Turns out I have an iron stomach," I finished, "and I didn't even know." "Wow," said Liz. "Wish I could have been there." "Me too," I smiled. "You know what?" "What?" "I was really scared of flying, and it turned out okay." "No, not okay. Great." For the first time, I was thinking out loud, and it was fun. "I think it might be time to try some other things I'm afraid of." "Like what?" asked Liz. I wasn't sure. I opened my mouth and just trusted that something would come out. "Talking," I said. "I think I'm going to try talking, not just to you and Judy and people on my list, but to everyone." "Good for you, Marley," said Liz, and she sounded proud. "And if I change, maybe other things will change too. Maybe Sally will be nicer. Maybe Mother and I will find more in common. Maybe the schools will reopen." "Maybe," said Liz, laughing, and then it was time to hang up. I wasn't really serious. I knew my talking wouldn't change all that, but as I drifted off to sleep, I thought about what Daddy had said when we were talking in the car. He said that things could be different in Little Rock if only the right people could find their voice. I wanted to be one of those people.